He was a billionaire CEO known for building cities out of nothing, but the one thing he couldn't build was a family. She was his loyal secretary, hiding not just heartbreak, but a secret that would shake his world to its core. When Claire Whitaker walked into the gala, late, pale, and with eyes that had seen too much, Benjamin Cole felt something shift. What made a woman so quiet step onto a stage and reveal a truth no one saw coming? Why would a man who had everything suddenly lose control over two tiny heartbeats he didn't even know existed? And when the world turned its back, who did they become? Alone, together, and changed by the very life they never planned for. This isn't just a story about betrayal or redemption. It's about the quiet strength of motherhood, the cost of silence, and how sometimes the life that leaves us speechless is the one we never expected to begin. If this touched something in you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Shining Stories. Let's begin. Benjamin Cole had hosted dozens of galas in his lifetime, but he'd never forgotten to breathe during one until tonight. The Cole estate shimmered under a curtain of warm lights, the kind strung carefully through the branches of 100-year-old oaks that had witnessed more southern summers than any man alive. The garden, trimmed to perfection, was dotted with tables dressed in ivory linens and crystal centerpieces. There was a soft hum of violins in the background, the notes dancing like fireflies between glasses of champagne and polite laughter. It was all as it should be. But Benjamin's chest felt tight. His event had become the hallmark of Savannah's philanthropic season. The annual gala for the Cole Housing Initiative had, over the years, raised millions for affordable homes and community renewal. It was the night where investors smiled, donors wrote big checks, and Benjamin played his part as the generous, composed CEO with a heart for the people. And yet, Claire wasn't there. He scanned the crowd for the third time in 10 minutes. His assistant, his anchor, was missing. Claire Whitaker had never missed a gala, never been late. She had a quiet way of managing chaos, always hovering at just the right distance with a clipboard in hand, ready to rescue him from awkward conversations or refill a glass before it was empty. She knew his rhythms better than he did. He reached for his bourbon, barely sipping it before setting it down again. His fingers tapped the rim of the glass twice. He stopped himself, aware that people were beginning to notice his restlessness. A few glances from board members, some subtle whispers. He pulled his shoulders back and adjusted the cuff of his suit jacket. She's probably caught in traffic, he told himself. But Claire didn't do traffic. She would have texted, called, left a voice memo, even something. The violin music swelled. The lead singer of the jazz trio began a soft rendition of Georgia on My Mind, and Benjamin caught a flash of silver near the entrance. He turned, and there she was. Claire stood at the edge of the gravel path, just beyond the soft floodlights. Her blue dress hugged her figure with understated elegance, but it was the way she held herself, like someone balancing more than just her own weight, that caught his attention. There was something different. Her shoulders didn't carry their usual calm confidence. Her gaze, always clear and steady, now seemed to drift as if looking for solid ground. And then, almost unconsciously, she placed a hand over her abdomen. Not a dramatic gesture, just a light, protective touch, brief, but intimate. Benjamin's eyes narrowed slightly. His mind tried to explain it away. Fatigue, a stomach bug, stress, but none of it felt right. Claire saw him. Across the lawn, her eyes locked with his, and in that one look, he felt the distance of everything unspoken between them, the silence of Asheville, the months since. She gave a small nod, not a greeting, not an apology, just acknowledgement. He took a step forward, ready to cross the garden toward her, but before he could, a burst of laughter from the side interrupted the moment. A local politician raised his glass toward Benjamin, drawing the attention of others. Speech time soon, someone called. Benjamin forced a smile and nodded, but inside, his heart had begun to pound, not with panic, but with a strange sort of recognition, as if some hidden truth had finally begun knocking from the inside out. And then he looked back. Claire wasn't walking toward him. She was walking past the tables, past the guests, past the bar and the mingling conversations. She was heading for the stage. He frowned, confused. She wasn't part of the program. That much he knew for certain. She'd made the run of show herself. What was she? Then it hit him. There was no pause, no moment of hesitation. Claire climbed the 3 steps up to the stage with a calmness that didn't match the rising tension in the air. Conversation slowed. A few people turned their heads. One of the musicians stopped playing mid-note. Benjamin's breath caught. He took a step forward, unsure of what he was about to do. Claire reached the microphone. She rested both hands on the podium, taking in the sight of the audience, not just the donors and politicians and board members, but the very people who represented everything Benjamin had built over 2 decades. Her voice hadn't spoken yet, but her presence spoke volumes. Benjamin froze. A ripple moved through the crowd like the moment before a summer storm. People began to murmur. Phones subtly lifted. A hush followed. Even the breeze seemed to still. Claire looked out, steady now, composed in a way that felt almost reverent. And in that breathless, suspended moment, Benjamin knew. He didn't know what she would say, but he knew it would change everything. Before Claire Whitaker ever worked behind Benjamin Cole's desk, she stood in a small motel room with a suitcase, a divorce paper, and no idea what came next. The wallpaper had peeled from one corner of the room, the air stale with humidity and distant regrets. Outside, the neon vacancy sign flickered like it couldn't decide whether to hope or surrender. Claire sat on the edge of the stiff mattress, staring at the folded legal document in her lap, her name printed in sharp black ink, just below his, the end of something that had once promised forever. She hadn't brought much, just the suitcase, a few clothes, and a photo of her mother from before the cancer took her. No keepsakes from the marriage, no jewelry, no letters, only silence and bruised trust. Her husband hadn't hit her, not with fists anyway. But control has many faces. Over the years, his affection had narrowed into suspicion. His compliments became corrections. And eventually, she realized that she had stopped speaking in full sentences, afraid even her tone might invite judgment. That motel was her first act of defiance, a rented room, a clean slate. Savannah had been a whisper in her mind somewhere soft enough to rebuild in, far enough from old patterns to start again. She didn't know anyone there. That was the point. The job at Cole & Hartman hadn't come easy. She started as a temp, answering phones and organizing storage closets. But Claire was patient, reliable, invisible, almost, but not unremarkable. She stayed late. She never missed a day. And slowly, she became indispensable. Benjamin Cole wasn't an easy man to work for. Sharp, fast-thinking, with a reputation for precision. He didn't waste words or tolerate excuses. But he noticed effort. He rewarded discipline. And, perhaps most importantly, he never raised his voice. Claire learned his preferences before he ever voiced them. The way he liked his files color-coded, how he arranged meeting notes by priority level, the exact temperature he preferred his coffee. They fell into rhythm, not quite friendship, but something like trust. Over the years, their professional boundaries blurred into quiet companionship. Not inappropriate, not romantic, just human. Some days, they didn't need to speak. Other days, they'd share stories from their childhoods, him in New York, her in a quiet Appalachian town. He once gave her a book he loved. She never told him she read it 3 times. But even Claire couldn't ignore what started to shift between them after that business trip to Asheville. It had snowed that night, just lightly, powdering the rooftop of the hotel like confectioner's sugar. They'd spent the day in back-to-back meetings, then dinner with clients, then drinks neither of them wanted but both endured. Back at the hotel, they'd said goodnight in the elevator, polite, distant, as always. She couldn't say what pulled her back to knock on his door 30 minutes later. They hadn't spoken of it since. No aftermath, no conversation. Just a quiet, mutual agreement to bury it beneath meetings and memos. But The silence didn't erase the memory. Claire had expected guilt, and she felt it especially in the morning when she buttoned her blouse with shaking fingers and avoided the mirror. But what surprised her more was the ache she carried home. An ache for something that had felt real, however fleeting. Weeks passed, business resumed, but her body didn't. At first, she blamed stress, then travel, then age. It wasn't until the smell of her morning coffee made her nauseous that the thought even crossed her mind. The test was a quiet thing, just one blue line, then two. She sat in her bathroom for nearly an hour, staring at it. Then she drove to the pharmacy, bought 2 more brands, and repeated the process. Same result. She was pregnant. Her first thought wasn't joy or fear, it was disbelief. She hadn't imagined a child in her future, not since the divorce, not with the job, the history, the silence. But as the days turned into weeks and the nausea became routine, something else crept in. Hope, a fragile kind, the kind you don't speak aloud, in case the universe is listening and decides to take it back. The first ultrasound confirmed what she hadn't dared to imagine. Twins? The nurse smiled, pointing at the screen. 2 little heartbeats, she said. Claire nodded, barely breathing. She wasn't ready to tell anyone. Not yet, not Benjamin, not the office, not even herself. Fully. Instead, she began adjusting quietly, swapping heels for softer flats, eating crackers at her desk to curb the queasiness. She scheduled doctor appointments during her lunch hour. She read books at night, one hand resting lightly on her stomach, the other underlining passages about resilience and grace. And in those still moments, Claire realized she wasn't just carrying children. She was carrying herself through fear, through past wounds, through uncertainty. She still didn't know what to say to Benjamin, how to say it, when. The words tangled every time she rehearsed them. Would he be angry, cold, dismissive, or worse kind? She told herself she would wait, just a little longer, until after the gala, until after the pressure eased, until the moment felt safe. But safety is fickle, and tonight, in that garden beneath the oaks, Claire had felt something shift inside her. It wasn't just the weight of her children, it was the weight of silence. And for the first time in a long time, she was ready to put it down. Benjamin Cole remembered every brick of the estate he built, but not the last time he let someone see him cry. The mansion overlooking the river had been his first real triumph, not just a home, but a legacy. He had watched it rise from bare foundation to polished marble, from blueprints to ballroom. Every archway, every window pane, every floorboard had been chosen with a purpose, a symbol of order, of permanence. He had built it 6 years ago, the same year he buried his wife. Her name was Grace. They'd met in their 20s, young, ambitious, wild with dreams and possibility. She was the kind of woman who remembered the name of every waitress, who danced barefoot in the kitchen, who once painted their bedroom wall deep forest green just because it reminded her of Oregon. Grace was the softest part of him. And when she died in a car accident just 2 miles from home, something inside Benjamin didn't just crack, it calcified. The grief didn't scream. It retreated, quietly, efficiently. He handled the funeral, the legalities, the condolences. He returned to the office the following week and never missed a day. People called him strong, resilient, but they didn't see how he sat in the garage for hours some nights, staring at the steering wheel of her car until dawn. He had loved her, and when he lost her, he made a vow not in words, but in action. No one would ever be allowed that close again. He filled his days with projects, acquisitions, expansions. From sunrise to long past dusk, he wore success like armor, but even armor, over time, begins to weigh heavy. And then came Claire. At first, she was just another assistant, competent, quiet, precise. She didn't linger, didn't flatter, didn't expect attention, but she noticed things. She noticed him without ever making him feel watched. He remembered the first time he let her adjust his calendar without asking. The first time he accepted coffee without checking the label. Trust, for Benjamin, didn't arrive in waves. It built in silent inches. He found himself listening when she spoke, even when she wasn't speaking to him. He began to wait for the soft click of her heels in the hallway. The way her voice brought a strange kind of calm to the office. And, eventually, without realizing it, he began to breathe easier when she was near. Still, he kept his boundaries, polished, professional, always measured, until Asheville. That night still haunted him, not because of what they did, but because of what it awakened. It had snowed, just enough to coat the sidewalks and make the city glow under street lamps. After a long day of client meetings, he and Claire had returned to the hotel. He remembered how tired she looked, how her coat clung to melting flakes. She had laughed just briefly at something he said, and in that laugh, he saw something he hadn't let himself feel in years: warmth. She knocked on his door later, said she forgot the meeting notes for the morning. He let her in, poured her tea, and for once, they talked. About things that didn't matter, and then things that did. He told her about Grace, not the polished version, but the raw parts, the guilt, the numbness, the fear that he'd become too cold to ever love again. Claire had listened, not with pity, but with presence. What happened after wasn't planned, wasn't forced. It was two people, tired of silence, reaching for something human. In the morning, she was gone before sunrise, and Benjamin had stood by the window for over an hour, wondering what it meant. In the weeks that followed, he told himself it was a mistake, that crossing that line was unprofessional, unwise, dangerous. He buried it the same way he buried everything else beneath meetings and schedules, strategy sessions and shareholder reports. But the truth, if he let himself admit it, was that he hadn't been the same since. He began to notice her more, not just her presence, but her absence. How the office felt colder when she wasn't there. How the sound of her laughter, rare as it was, lingered longer in the air than it should have. And when she began pulling away subtly, but surely he told himself not to ask, not to pry, not to feel, because feeling meant risk, and risk meant pain, and pain, he had promised, would never come that close again. But now, standing just yards from the stage at the gala, watching Claire rest her hands on the podium like someone bracing for a storm, Benjamin felt the undeniable thud of something breaking open inside him. It wasn't panic. It wasn't even fear. It was the quiet realization that he had let something good slip too far away. She had walked through the garden alone. She had stood before this crowd without warning, and he, so accustomed to control, was utterly unprepared. He didn't know what she would say, but he knew it would matter. And the worst part, he couldn't undo his silence. He had buried his emotions so deep that now, even the truth might come too late. The lights above the stage glinted against her hair as she looked out over the audience. Her gaze didn't search for him, but he wished it would. Benjamin took one step forward, then another. His chest was tight, not with pride, not with shame, but with the weight of everything unsaid. The room hushed the way a forest does before a storm. It wasn't sudden, but collective. A ripple of quiet, like a held breath spreading through the garden as Claire Whitaker stood behind the podium, both hands gently resting on its polished wood. The string quartet stopped mid-note. Champagne flutes paused halfway to lips. Forks lowered without touching plates. And somewhere, near the third row, Benjamin Cole felt the weight of every heartbeat in his chest. She didn't look at him right away. Claire stood tall, not out of confidence, but necessity. Her body had grown accustomed to carrying more than it should, and tonight it carried not just the children inside her, but a truth she could no longer bear to keep silent. Her eyes scanned the crowd, the donors, the partners, the journalists, the people whose names she had printed on place cards just 2 days before. She saw confusion, curiosity, polite expectation, but not yet judgment. She took a breath. "I wasn't scheduled to speak tonight," she began, her voice steady, though quiet enough that a few guests instinctively leaned in. "But I realized recently," she continued, "that silence, especially the kind born from fear, can be more dangerous than any truth." Her eyes flickered then. Just briefly, to him. Benjamin stood still, not blinking, his hands clenched lightly in front of him. He had spent years mastering stillness in boardrooms and during hostile negotiations, but none of that had prepared him for this. Claire returned her gaze to the crowd. 6 years ago, I arrived in Savannah with nothing but a suitcase and a fractured sense of self. I took a job that I wasn't sure I was qualified for, in a company I didn't think I belonged in. And for the first time in a long time, I found stability, a rhythm, a sense of quiet purpose. The words weren't dramatic, but they landed with a kind of gravity that reshaped the air. I have always done my best to keep my personal life separate, she said softly, to stay in the background, to do the work, and never ask for anything more than respect. She paused then, and for the first time, the tremble in her hands became visible. But life doesn't always respect boundaries. Sometimes it surprises you. A breeze moved through the trees, rustling the linens and brushing a strand of hair across her cheek. She tucked it behind her ear, slowly, carefully, like even that motion was part of her preparation. I am expecting twins, she said, her voice clear now, reaching every ear, every corner of the estate. There was no audible reaction at first, just stillness, the kind that sinks into the bones. Claire could hear her own breath now, measured and slow. She placed a hand lightly over her stomach deliberately, tenderly, not to perform, but to anchor herself. She looked at Benjamin then, fully, no more glances, no more shadows. And the father of my children, she said, is Benjamin Cole. No one moved. It wasn't shock, not entirely. It was something closer to suspended disbelief, a communal freeze in time, where every face registered the same moment differently. Some turned toward Benjamin, others didn't dare. One woman near the front gasped quietly. A man in the back shifted in his seat, as if unsure whether to applaud or leave. And then, the click. It came from the left. A photographer freelance, likely, young, eager, always watching. He'd raised his camera before anyone could stop him. The shutter sounded again, then again, each click like a hammer to glass. Benjamin's eyes didn't leave Claire's, but he heard it. The ripple beginning, murmurs spreading, phones being raised, the beginning of something they could no longer control. Claire exhaled, not relief, not regret, just the end of a burden. She stepped back from the microphone without a bow or a smile, no dramatic exit. She simply moved down the stairs, one careful step at a time, and Benjamin, still frozen, watched her pass through the crowd like a woman stepping through fire she had set herself, knowing it would either destroy her or free her. People turned to him now, not with anger, but with expectation, as if waiting to see whether the man they thought they knew would shatter or stand. But Benjamin didn't move. His world, once so carefully orchestrated, had just tilted beyond his reach, and yet, in the middle of it, he didn't feel anger, or betrayal, or even fear. He felt something far more dangerous for a man like him. He felt exposed. For years, he had controlled every variable, every headline, every risk. But, in one sentence, Claire had undone the fortress he'd built not maliciously, but with quiet, devastating honesty. And now, as murmurs rose and the buzz of media began to spread like wildfire through the night, Benjamin Cole stood not as the CEO, not as the polished public figure, but as a man staring at the reflection of himself through someone else's truth. The moment held, hung, balanced on the edge of everything he hadn't said and everything he had left too long in silence. And Claire. She didn't look back. She had held herself together for months, but even steel bends under enough pressure. Claire Whitaker stepped down from the stage into a blur of flashes, gasps, and murmured disbelief. The air felt too thin, like it had been drained of all its oxygen the moment she spoke his name. Reporters swarmed near the garden's edge, their cameras blinking like fireflies with an agenda. She kept her gaze down, not because of shame, but because she didn't have the energy to meet another questioning stare. Each step toward the exit felt heavier than the last. She walked past linen-covered tables and half-finished dinners, weaving between donors in sequined gowns and board members who suddenly found the floor very interesting. She didn't look for Benjamin, didn't want to know if he had followed. Her car was parked along the back gate. The valet had been instructed to keep it close, just in case a suggestion she had made herself weeks ago. Not knowing how badly she'd need it tonight, the engine purred to life, but the silence inside the vehicle was deafening. She drove through the quiet streets of Savannah, past the riverfront where tourists had gathered just hours earlier. Now, all that remained were distant shadows and the occasional flicker of a street lamp reflected in puddles from the evening's brief drizzle. By the time she reached her small townhouse, the tension had burrowed deep between her shoulder blades. She made it to the bathroom and threw up, not just from nausea, but from the emotional whiplash that gripped her entire body. She stared at herself in the mirror afterward, pale, tired, 36, and pregnant with twins. Her face no longer belonged to the woman who had once believed in second chances. It belonged to someone who had fought too many silent battles without rest. She peeled off the dress carefully, as if afraid it might split her open further. Her hands shook. Her stomach felt too tight. She lay on her side in bed, one hand resting over the swell of her abdomen, counting the seconds between each flutter of movement. The babies kicked lightly, reassuring her, for now. But something inside her whispered that she couldn't keep doing this alone. Morning came with no softness. Claire arrived at the office early, like always. She passed the front desk quietly, avoiding the receptionist's wide eyes. She could feel the whispers behind her. Of course they'd seen the headlines. Secretary claims Cole's twins as gala bombshell. Power couple or PR crisis. The photos had spread like wildfire overnight. Her name was now Google Able. She tried to ignore it, tried to act like work could still be a refuge. She made it to her desk, turned on the monitor, and opened the first email. But her vision swam. Her ears buzzed. Her hands trembled even as she tried to grip the edge of the table. A sharp cramp twisted across her lower abdomen. She stood up. Then the lights dimmed. Her knees buckled, and the last thing she saw was the edge of her chair rushing toward her face. The hospital ceiling was too white, sterile, unforgiving. Claire blinked slowly, trying to make sense of the IV in her arm, the soft beeping beside her. The room smelled like antiseptic and cotton, clean, but not comforting. A nurse entered quietly, adjusting something on the monitor. "You're awake," she said gently. "Try not to move too fast." "What happened?" Claire whispered, though her throat burned. "You collapsed at work," the nurse replied. "They brought you in right away. You were dehydrated, blood pressure low, and your body's under a great deal of stress." Claire's hand instinctively went to her stomach. "They're okay," the nurse added quickly. "But the doctor wants you to stay overnight. Observation, bed rest, at least for the next few days." Claire nodded faintly. "I don't want anyone notified," she murmured. "Especially not." The nurse gave her a hesitant look. "I'm sorry," she said, "but he's already here." Benjamin had arrived not long after. He hadn't asked for permission, hadn't called ahead. One of the interns at the firm had seen the ambulance and told his assistant. That was all it took. Now, he stood outside the door, one hand pressed against the cold glass panel, watching the woman inside lie still beneath thin white sheets. He had no script for this, no meeting agenda, no plan, just a feeling raw and unfamiliar crushing his chest from the inside. She looked smaller than he remembered, even in sleep. She looked like she was holding herself together out of habit. He stepped inside. The beeping continued. Claire didn't move. He stood at the foot of her bed, unsure whether to speak. Apologies gathered on his tongue, but none of them felt right. What could he possibly say now that wouldn't sound hollow? So he sat quietly, not as a CEO, not as the man whose name now splashed across every business blog in the Southeast. Just a man. And as he looked at her, pale, silent, vulnerable, Benjamin Cole felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Helpless. Not because he couldn't fix it, but because he didn't know if she even wanted him to try. Claire stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, glazed with exhaustion. When she saw him, her expression didn't harden. It fell, softly, like a curtain closing. She turned her face away, toward the window where the morning light had just begun to stretch across the sill, not in anger, not in resentment, but in resignation. She had no energy left to hope. Mistakes don't always knock. Sometimes they burst through the door, demanding to be paid. The boardroom was colder than usual, though the temperature hadn't changed. The mahogany table stretched endlessly in front of Benjamin, and every face around it looked older, sterner, harder to read. He sat at the head, as he always had, but today, his chair didn't feel like a seat of power. It felt like a witness stand. No one was shouting. That made it worse. Ben, Charles Whitman, the lead board member, began slowly, folding his hands. You've been a pillar of this company for over a decade. No one's questioning that. But the current climate demands transparency. Benjamin didn't respond. He knew what was coming. The phrasing was deliberate, polished, vague enough for PR but sharp enough to cut. We're asking that you voluntarily step back, Charles continued, effective immediately, pending a full internal review. Step back. Benjamin's voice was quiet, almost detached. From my own company, Charles offered a tight smile. From your position as CEO, temporarily, it's not personal, just necessary. A few board members avoided his gaze. Others stared too directly, as if daring him to argue. It wasn't about Claire, not entirely. It was about optics, headlines, stockholders whispering, clients reevaluating contracts, and under it all the scent of blood in the water. He signed the document without reading it, because the truth was, even if he fought, the decision had already been made. The elevator ride down from the executive floor was long, though only 20 seconds. He didn't go to his office. He walked straight out to his car. The driver looked surprised to see him at this hour. No office today? Sir, no, Benjamin said flatly. Drive. He didn't give a destination. His phone buzzed against his thigh, again and again. Messages, mentions, media requests, headlines. He ignored them until one notification caught his eye. An unmarked email, no subject, just a link and 2 attachments. Against his better judgment, he opened it. The first photo showed him 10 years younger, standing beside a bulldozed stretch of land. The caption had been pulled from an old local blog, Low-Income Neighborhood to Make Way for Luxury Units. Residents protest. The second image was grainier. A scanned letter, handwritten, emotional. A plea from a woman who had lost her home to that same project. He remembered it, vaguely. A small block in East Atlanta, zoned for redevelopment. The numbers had made sense, but the faces he hadn't seen them. The email didn't threaten anything explicitly, but the message was clear. Someone was digging, and they had found the past. Benjamin closed his eyes. It wasn't just about the babies, or Claire, or the board. It was bigger now. It was everything. The narrative was slipping out of his hands and falling into someone else's. He knew who. Frank Delaney had always been too quiet for a man that dangerous. A former partner turned rival. Frank had built his own empire from the pieces Benjamin didn't want. He knew where to strike. He knew when to wait. And he had never needed a knife, just the right whisper at the wrong time. Benjamin felt the walls closing in. Claire was still in the hospital. The firm was on the verge of fracture. And now, old ghosts had crawled out of the past, dressed in ink and photos. He didn't realize he was gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles ached. His phone buzzed again. This time, a message from the hospital. Claire Whitaker's chart update is ready for review. Immediate contact recommended. No emotion, just a system message. But it was enough. For the first time that morning, Benjamin moved with purpose. The hallway to the maternity ward felt impossibly long. He passed couples with balloons and flowers, smiles, hope, laughter, all things he couldn't remember the last time he held. When he reached Claire's room, the nurse looked up, surprised. "She's resting," the woman said gently. "She's asked for privacy. I need 5 minutes." The nurse hesitated, then nodded. Inside, the room was dimly lit, the blinds half closed against the afternoon sun. Claire lay on her side, facing the window. An IV ran slowly beside her. The heart monitor beeped, calm but constant. He approached quietly. She didn't turn. "I heard," he said softly, "about the stress. The babies." "I should have don't," she interrupted, still facing away. Her voice was weak, but it held enough force to stop him. He stood there, unsure of what to do with his hands, his words, his shame. "I know what it looks like," he said after a moment. "Like I chose silence, like I didn't care. But the truth is, I didn't know how to feel. I've lived too long pretending not to." Claire didn't reply. "I've lost my title," he said quietly. "At least for now. The board wants distance. The media's digging. My past is surfacing. And all I can think about—" He stopped. "All I can think about is you. Still." She didn't turn, not in rejection, but in fatigue. Her silence wasn't punishment. It was exhaustion. The kind that comes not just from pregnancy, or scandal, or hospital lights, but from carrying too much, for too long, alone. Benjamin sat in the chair by her bed, not to fix anything, not to argue, but to stay. And in that small act, for the first time in a very long time, he let himself be a man who had failed but didn't want to fail again. When Benjamin opened the envelope, the handwriting stopped him cold. He hadn't seen that name in 20 years. The letters were jagged, sharp-edged, slanted to the right, still arrogant, still sure of their place on the page. Just 6 letters, but enough to drag up an entire decade of buried history. Frank. The last time they had spoken, Benjamin had been 30, sitting across a folding table in a dimly lit office trailer on the edge of a construction site in El Paso. The air had smelled of hot dust and ambition. The bid had been simple 2 firms competing for a stretch of government-owned land meant for redevelopment. Benjamin had offered precision. Frank had offered favors. Benjamin had won, and Frank had never forgiven him. He slid the rest of the envelope's contents onto the kitchen table. It was early. The sun had barely risen, casting a soft amber glow through the windows of his riverfront townhouse. The same house Claire had once helped him pick out curtains for. The same house that now echoed with silence and the quiet hum of things falling apart. There were photos, documents, a timeline, snippets of text messages between former employees, public records tied together like pieces on a murder board. The message wasn't subtle. Someone wanted to bury him. The Texas project was ancient history, legally clean, morally murkier. Back then, he'd been hungry, ruthless, the kind of man who could push through a rezoning request without blinking. Families had been displaced, small businesses closed, but no laws were broken, only trust. And now, someone Frank was resurfacing the worst of it. Benjamin picked up the note again. Funny how the past always comes home. Let's see how the board feels about this. There was no signature, just a stamped return address in Boston. Frank's new city, his new empire. Benjamin leaned back in his chair. The timing wasn't random, not after the gala, not while Claire was still in the hospital, not when the company was already teetering from scandal. This was orchestrated. Frank had waited for the perfect moment when Benjamin's public image was already fragile, when whispers were turning into headlines, and when the man himself was just tired enough to flinch. And worst of all, he wasn't alone. Benjamin had noticed it in the last board meeting. The way 2 members, Langston and Parrish, had avoided his eye. The way Whitman's tone had shifted from support to concern. They were being courted. Frank wasn't just attacking from the outside, he was lobbying from within. The crown was in play, and it wasn't just a matter of pride. It was control, identity, everything Benjamin had built. He ran a hand over his face, then stood slowly, walking to the stove to pour the coffee he had forgotten about. It was cold. He didn't care. His phone buzzed again. Claire's nurse, Vitals stable, but she's requested no visitors until further notice. Of course she had. And he understood. She needed quiet. Not another storm. Not more attention. Certainly not to be dragged into the chaos now looming over him like a gathering thunderhead. He stared out the window. A boat moved slowly along the river, cutting through the morning mist. Somewhere, someone was beginning their day with optimism. But Benjamin, he was standing in a kitchen filled with old ghosts and newer regrets, staring at the edge of a war he didn't start but might have to finish. That afternoon, his legal team confirmed what he suspected. "Delaney's fingerprints are all over this," said Marla, his head of risk management. "He's been leaking pieces to journalists for weeks, mostly smaller outlets. But the story's heating up. If we don't act, it'll break nationally by Friday." Benjamin said nothing. "He's meeting with Langston next week," she added, "probably making a play for the CEO's seat. He's promising a clean slate reputation-wise, a new era for the company." He exhaled through his nose. "You want to issue a statement?" she asked, "or deny and wait it out?" Benjamin stood at the window again, watching the sky darken over the water. "No, no." He turned to face her. "I don't want to fight this like the last time. No counters, no spin." Marla narrowed her eyes. "You're going to let him win." "I didn't say that," he replied. "I just said I'm not using the same weapons." She waited. "I'll decide by morning," he said. "You're dismissed." The house was too quiet that night. Benjamin sat alone in the study, surrounded by books he hadn't read in years, trophies he no longer cared about, and the bitter taste of choices catching up to him. He thought of Claire, lying in that hospital room, eyes turned toward the window, not in anger, but because she had nothing left to give. And now, if he fought back, if he launched a counterattack against Frank, the media wouldn't stop at him. They'd go for her. The babies, her past, everything she had tried to protect. He had the resources to win, but at what cost could he really put her through that? Again, or worse, could he survive knowing he hadn't tried? It wasn't just business anymore. It never had been. It was about what kind of man he wanted to be when the dust settled. And for the first time in a long time, Benjamin Cole wasn't sure. He walked to the balcony and opened the door. The wind was cool against his skin. Somewhere in the distance, church bells chimed the hour. He had until morning. In the hush of her hospital room, Claire whispered to her unborn children, promising them everything she wasn't sure she could give. The room smelled faintly of hand sanitizer and clean cotton sheets. Outside, the city stirred with its usual rhythms, delivery trucks rumbling, distant sirens cutting through the air, but inside, time had slowed to the cadence of a heartbeat monitor and the soft rustle of hospital gowns. She rested one hand on the swell of her belly, now more prominent, more undeniable. The monitors were quiet, blinking steady. The babies were fine. For now. She closed her eyes and whispered again, this time without words, just breath, just presence, just the weight of everything she felt and couldn't say out loud. She had once imagined this moment differently. Warm light, a nursery filled with soft blues and yellows, laughter, a partner sitting beside her, reading names from a book, arguing gently over whether Emma was too old-fashioned or Caleb too trendy. But life had other plans. Instead, she was here, alone, in a hospital room at 7 a.m., her body tired, her soul stretched thin, and the man who fathered her children fighting battles she couldn't afford to join. She had tried not to think about leaving. Not really, but the thought crept in at night, between the contractions that weren't quite real and the fear that always was. Would it be easier for Benjamin, for the company, for the children, if she just disappeared, took a quiet job in another state, raised them without the headlines, without the board meetings, without him? She hated herself for even considering it. A soft knock interrupted her spiral. Nurse Margot stepped in. Late 50s, kind eyes, the kind of woman who wore her experience like a second stethoscope. Claire had grown used to her presence, the gentle voice, the no-nonsense warmth. Vitals look good today, Margot said, checking the chart. You're stable. We'll keep watching, but the babies seem content. Claire smiled faintly. They're stubborn already. Good. Stubborn is useful in this world. Margot paused, glancing at the monitor. You know, she added, almost casually, the first time I heard my son's heartbeat, I cried for 20 minutes in the parking lot. Didn't even put the car in drive. Claire blinked. You did? Oh, honey. Margot chuckled. I was 19, no family nearby. The father? He ran the moment I told him. All I had was a used sedan, a job at the diner, and a little gray cassette player with the recording of that heartbeat. She sat down beside Claire, folding her hands in her lap. But I played that thing every night. Reminded me I wasn't alone. Claire looked down at her belly, then back at the nurse. I think I keep waiting to feel brave, she admitted. Margot smiled gently. Brave doesn't feel like a war cry, sweetheart. It feels like standing up when you want to lie down. It feels like staying, even when it hurts. It feels like whispering to someone who isn't born yet and promising them the world when you're not sure you've got anything left to give. Claire's throat tightened. She nodded once, slowly, and in that silence, something shifted, not dramatically, not in fireworks, just a quiet realignment of the soul, a reminder that being scared didn't make her weak. It made her a mother. She rested later that afternoon, finally asleep for the first time in hours. The light through the blinds softened the sharp corners of the hospital room, casting long stripes across the blanket pulled over her legs. When she woke, there was an envelope on the tray beside her water glass. No name on the front, just her room number written in ballpoint pen. She opened it with slow fingers. Inside was a letter typed, formal, and a copy of a court motion. Claire read the first line twice before the words truly landed. Notice of request to review custodial agreement. Party of interest, Thomas Whitaker. Her ex-husband. She felt the air leave her lungs. The letter continued legal language, citations, bureaucratic coldness. But the message was clear. Thomas, who hadn't seen their daughter in almost a year. Thomas, who had skipped child support payments and canceled birthday visits. Thomas, who had barely asked about the pregnancy when he found out. Now he wanted to challenge the custodial agreement, claiming concern for the emotional stability of the current home environment. Her hands shook. She read it again. Mental distress, public controversy, unfit future planning. She placed the paper down carefully, as if touching it too long might make it more real. And then she wept. Not loud, not dramatic, but the kind of crying that came from a place so deep. It felt like it had no voice, just weight, just salt, just the ache of being made to prove, again, that she was enough. She wasn't afraid of Thomas, but she feared what this meant, that somehow her story, her survival, her strength was still being rewritten by men who had never taken the time to understand her. They only ever saw a problem to solve, a risk to manage, a weakness to exploit, but never the mother, never the woman who had stayed through the silence, through the shame, through the uncertainty. She covered her face with both hands, and for the first time in weeks, she didn't try to hold it all in. Benjamin had built towers of steel and glass, but couldn't build the words to say I was wrong. The sky over Savannah was turning the color of bruise and rose. That hour before evening, when shadows stretched longer and the city felt quieter, softer, more fragile somehow. He stood in the hospital's parking garage for a few moments before going in, fingers clenched loosely around a paper bag. Inside was a small carton of chocolate milk, Claire's favorite when she used to pull late nights at the office, and a worn paperback titled, Your Baby's First 100 Days. He didn't know why he brought the book. Maybe because it felt like a peace offering. Maybe because it was the first time he was allowing himself to believe in the future as something he could be part of. The elevator ride to her floor was silent, save for the hum of fluorescent lights. He pressed the button with an unsteady hand. He didn't rehearse anything. Every time he tried, the words collapsed before they fully formed. At the door to her room, he paused, the same door he had stood behind once before, unsure of whether his presence would be comfort or intrusion. He knocked gently. No answer. Inside. The room was dim. Claire lay on her side, face turned toward the window, her breathing deep and slow, asleep. Benjamin stepped in quietly. He placed the milk and the book on the small table by her bed. Then, slowly, he sat, not in the stiff hospital chair by the corner, but the one right next to her, close enough to hear the rhythm of her breath, close enough to feel the tension still held in her shoulders. Even in sleep, he looked at her hands, unpainted nails, faint lines along the knuckles from too much typing, too many years spent fixing other people's chaos. He remembered the last time he held a hand like that without a contract between them. His late wife, Grace. He had forgotten the feel of touch without transaction, without performance, just presence. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Nurse Margot peeked in, holding a clipboard. When she saw him, she smiled gently. Evening. Mr. Cole. She's been resting well today. Benjamin nodded. Thank you. Margot stepped inside, checking the monitors with practiced ease. First time, Dad. He hesitated. Feels strange hearing it out loud. She smiled. It'll feel even stranger holding them, but in a good way. He exhaled, a small chuckle escaping despite himself. I'm not sure I know how to be that person. Most don't, she said. You learn one diaper, one bottle, one midnight panic at a time. He looked down at his hands. I lost my wife 6 years ago, he said quietly. Car accident. Out of nowhere. One morning, she kissed me goodbye. That night, she was gone. Margot's expression softened. I think I never let myself feel it fully. He continued. I just built more projects, took more meetings, filled the space with noise. She wouldn't want you stuck in that space forever. He nodded, eyes glassy. The night in Asheville, he said, it wasn't planned, it just happened. And afterward, I convinced myself it was a mistake, but it wasn't. It was the first time in years I felt anything. Claire stirred behind them. Margot glanced toward the bed and gently touched Benjamin's shoulder. Talk to her, she whispered. You'll know what to say. Then she left the room, closing the door behind her with the quiet of someone who understood when to exit a scene. Claire opened her eyes slowly. Their gazes met, no alarm, no surprise, just the simple acknowledgement of time passing of wounds not quite closed. Benjamin leaned forward slightly. I brought you something, he said, voice barely above a murmur. He gestured to the milk and book. She followed his motion, then turned back to him with the ghost of a smile. Chocolate milk, she whispered. You remembered. I remember more than you think. A long pause. I'm sorry, he said finally. Claire didn't rush to respond. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't empty. It was full of things unsaid, of heartbreak, of questions too heavy for one sentence. She shifted, placing her hands gently over her belly. Benjamin watched, unsure if he should speak again. Then she looked down. They kicked this morning, she said softly. Just once, but strong. He swallowed. May I? She hesitated, then nodded. He reached out slowly, as if the air itself might shatter. His palm landed gently on the curve of her belly. For a few seconds, nothing. Then, a flutter. Small. Sudden. Real. He inhaled sharply. It was like touching lightning, but soft. Not jarring, just awakening. He looked at Claire, eyes wide, disbelief mixing with something raw, something unguarded. I felt them, he whispered. She nodded. Neither of them said anything for a while, because in that moment, nothing else mattered. Not the board, not the press, not Frank Delaney's shadow or Claire's legal threats from her past. Just two people, sitting beside a hospital bed, bound not by plans or promises, but by a heartbeat beneath skin. Finally. Benjamin spoke again, soft, certain. "I don't want to run anymore. There comes a moment when silence no longer protects you, it only strengthens the lie." Benjamin stood outside the boardroom, fingers curled around a single page of handwritten notes. The hallway was quiet, carpeted in the kind of luxury that muffled footsteps and tension alike. Beyond the glass doors, 12 members of the Cole and Hartman board waited, faces he had known for years, some allies, some opponents, all watching. He inhaled, not for courage, but to remind himself that this wasn't about saving face. It was about finally choosing to show his. The room was silent when he entered. No introductions, no greetings. Just the low hum of the air conditioning and the sound of chairs adjusting as he took his place at the head of the table. "I asked for this meeting," Benjamin began, "not to defend myself but to tell the truth, all of it." Some eyebrows lifted, a few leaned back, arms crossed, but no one interrupted. "I've made mistakes," he said simply. "Personal, professional, some old, some recent, and most of them were buried beneath silence." He looked around the table. No anger, just calm, firm, present. "I want to speak first about Claire Whitaker." At the mention of her name, a subtle shift in the room. The scandal was still fresh, still simmering. Yes, she's pregnant. Yes, I'm the father. And no, it wasn't planned, but it wasn't careless. It wasn't scandalous. It was human. He paused. "We shared something real, but I walked away. Not because of shame, but because I was afraid. I let grief rule my life for 6 years, and I let fear convince me that silence was the safer path." He glanced down at his notes, then set them aside. He didn't need them. "I also want to address the Texas project. Many years ago, I approved a land redevelopment that displaced low-income residents. We followed every regulation, but I didn't fight hard enough for the people behind the numbers. I regret that, deeply." A few murmurs, some exchanged glances. Benjamin met each pair of eyes with unwavering steadiness. And Frank Delaney, he's behind the leaks, the rumors, the campaign against me. He's lobbying to take my seat by dressing himself in a cleaner story. Let him. I'm not here to fight shadows. I'm here to own the man I've been and choose the man I want to be next. He placed both hands on the table, effective immediately. "I'm stepping back from day-to-day operations, not because you asked me to, but because I need to." Gasps, soft, restrained. "I've established a foundation with Claire focused on housing access for single mothers and vulnerable families. That's where my heart is now. That's where I'm going to show up." He let the words settle like dust after a storm. Silence. Until Langston, usually first to challenge him, leaned forward. "This isn't a resignation." "No," Benjamin said. "It's a redirection. I'll remain on the board, but I no longer want to lead by title. I want to lead by example." Another pause. Then came the unexpected. A voice from the far end of the table, raspy, weathered. Charles Dunning, one of the oldest members, semi-retired, rarely spoke unless necessary. "I lost my daughter 5 years ago," Charles said, eyes distant. "She died thinking I never supported her choices. Because I didn't say anything. I thought my silence protected her. But it only made her feel alone." The room held its breath. "I know what it costs to speak too late. I wish someone had shown me what you're doing now." He looked directly at Benjamin. "I stand with you." One by one, others followed, some with cautious nods, some with emotion too deep for words. Not all agreed, but enough did. The press conference that followed was brief. Benjamin stood alone behind a simple podium. No company logo, no spin doctors. "I'm not here to manage a narrative," he said. "I'm here to take responsibility." He repeated the truths he had told the board. He named the mistakes. He named the woman. He named the children not yet born, and he didn't flinch. When the questions came, he answered. When they didn't, he waited. Because sometimes, the absence of a question speaks louder than the loudest scandal. Later that evening, as headlines began to shift tone, Cole steps down, with grace. Truth over strategy. CEO turns focus to family and service. Benjamin sat on the same hospital balcony where Claire had once stood alone. This time, he wasn't hiding. He was letting the world see him, not as the man who built towers, but the one who finally stood on ground made of truth. Claire stepped out of the hospital for the first time in almost 2 weeks, the September air brushing gently against her skin. The sun was low, casting long, quiet shadows across the pavement. A soft wind rustled through the crepe myrtles, and somewhere nearby, a bird was singing not loudly, just enough to remind her the world was still turning. At the curb, Benjamin waited. He wasn't in a tailored suit today. No cufflinks, no leather briefcase, just a soft blue sweater, khakis, and the same quiet steadiness he had brought into her hospital room 2 nights before. He opened the car door without a word, offered her his hand. She hesitated just a breath, but then took it. She expected him to drive her home, to the small townhouse she'd rented on the quieter side of Savannah. But the turns he took were familiar in a different way. The bridge, the avenue lined with old oaks, the gravel path that led up to a white columned house with black shutters and ivy crawling gently along its side. His home. She looked at him as he parked. He didn't pressure, just waited. The doctor said you'll need space, he said softly. Better care, peace. Claire looked toward the wraparound porch. The rocking chair still there, the hydrangeas still in bloom, and I'll stay out of your way, he added, unless you want me in it. There was no push in his voice, just presence. She nodded. They moved like strangers in a shared memory. The house was quiet, but not hollow. Benjamin had prepared a guest room downstairs, fresh sheets, a recliner, a small bookshelf with 3 novels she'd once mentioned liking. He didn't try to impress her. He tried to remember her. It mattered. In the days that followed, they fell into a rhythm, not lovers, not yet, not really, but 2 people learning the shape of each other's silence. Morning tea on the back patio, evening walks around the garden path, Benjamin reading aloud from a parenting book while Claire folded tiny onesies. And once, he burned a batch of blueberry muffins. The smoke alarm went off. Claire laughed for the first time in weeks. There were no declarations, no confessions, just moments. Moments where she noticed the way he gently smoothed the sheets before she lay down. Or how he kept a list by the fridge titled Claire's Cravings, adding entries like peach sorbet and cheddar with pickles as the days went by. How he never touched her without asking, but also never left her feeling alone. One night, after dinner, she passed the nursery and saw him sitting on the floor, tools scattered around him. He was building the crib. It was simple white wood, no frills. His hands moved carefully, almost reverently. Claire stood by the doorway, unnoticed for a moment, watching him align each piece with a kind of tenderness that surprised her. When he finished, he sat back on his heels. The room was dim, quiet. He placed one hand on the rail, closed his eyes, and then he broke. No sound, just the shaking of his shoulders. Tears he didn't wipe away. A man alone with the weight of the life he was trying to rebuild, not from guilt, but from hope he barely knew how to hold. Claire stepped in. She didn't speak. She didn't ask. She just knelt behind him, her arms folding around his frame. He didn't flinch. He leaned back into her, into the comfort, into the kind of grace he'd always offered others but never thought he'd deserve himself. And together, they stayed there, not fixing, not planning, just being. Later, as she helped him fold a soft blanket over the crib, he whispered, "I don't know how to be the kind of father they deserve." Claire touched his hand. "You'll learn," she said. He nodded, blinking hard. And then, just as he reached to turn off the nursery light, she stopped him. "They're already home. Ben," she whispered, "you just didn't see it yet." The sun was just beginning to rise when Benjamin held his newborn son for the first time. The sky outside the hospital window was a quiet watercolor, pale peach blending into soft blue. with the last shadows of night dissolving like a secret finally let go. The world had not yet begun its noise. The city slept, and in that pocket of stillness, a man who once lived for steel and symmetry was learning how to hold something fragile. His son was swaddled in a blanket with tiny stars printed along the edge. His face, barely the size of Benjamin's palm, was wrinkled, reddish, a little confused by the brightness around him. But his breathing was strong, his heart steady, his existence undeniable. Benjamin looked down and saw his own hands trembling, not from fear, from reverence. He had made deals with governors, closed billion-dollar acquisitions, walked into courtrooms without flinching. But this left him breathless. Claire rested in the bed nearby, still pale but glowing with something ancient and powerful. The twins had come 3 weeks early, unexpected, fast but healthy. The daughter had been first quiet, calm. The son came minutes later, louder, more impatient. Claire had laughed through tears when the nurse said, "They already have personalities." Benjamin had stood stunned, unable to speak, not out of panic, but because something in him had been rewritten, not erased, just softened, like stone remembering it was once sand. He named them together with Claire. The girl, Eliza Hope. The boy, Julian Reed. Names with weight, with meaning. Eliza. After Claire's grandmother, Julian. A name Benjamin had circled in the margins of an old journal from college, one he hadn't opened in years. They didn't overthink it. They chose from memory, not strategy, from love, not logic. Later that morning, when Claire was asleep and the babies tucked into their bassinets, Benjamin stepped into the small family lounge just outside the maternity ward. He opened his notebook, the leather one Claire had given him on his birthday, the one he hadn't written in until now, and he began to write. One letter for each child. No grand declarations, no promises he couldn't keep. Just truth, the kind he had spent too long running from. To Eliza, he wrote, "You are my calm after the storm, the quiet I never knew I needed. If you ever feel like the world is too loud, know this: your voice will always be enough. I'll be there to hear it, even when you think no one is listening." To Julian, he wrote, "You came into this world roaring, and I hope you never forget that strength lives in your voice. But also remember, gentleness isn't weakness. It's courage, softened by love, and I'll remind you of that every day." He didn't write much more, just enough. He folded each letter and slid them into envelopes labeled only with names and dates. No instruction, no flair, just presence, on paper. He left them on the table next to Claire's bag, not to hide them, but because he didn't yet have the voice to read them aloud. He hoped one day they'd be found at the right moment, that they'd speak when he could not. But Claire saw them sooner. That afternoon, while Benjamin stepped away to take a call, she reached for her lip balm in the side pocket of her bag and found the envelopes. She sat still, holding both in her lap for a long time before opening them. Her eyes moved slowly across each word, each curve of his pen. Tears didn't come all at once. They arrived like the tide, soft at first, then steady. She pressed the pages to her chest, not because they were perfect, but because they were real, and because they held something she thought she'd lost: a future not built in fear, but in truth, in tenderness, in togetherness. When Benjamin returned, he didn't ask if she read them. She didn't say anything either. But when he sat beside her, she leaned into him without hesitation, and that was enough. That evening, just before sunset, the hospital granted them a moment of fresh air on the private balcony outside Claire's room. The twins were sleeping in bassinets by her side. Benjamin stood behind her, one hand resting lightly on her shoulder. No suits, no headlines, no boardrooms, just the hum of cicadas in the fading light. Claire picked up Eliza and placed her gently into Benjamin's arms, then Julian, cradled on her own chest. The four of them stood like that, a constellation in human form, rearranged into something new and eternal. Benjamin looked at the sky, and for once, he had nothing to say, no pitch, no plan, no solution to offer, just awe. He had built empires, but this was the life that finally left him speechless. Sometimes, the hardest battles are not fought in boardrooms or hospitals, but in the quiet corners of our own hearts. This story reminds us that it's never too late to speak the truth, to ask for forgiveness, or to begin again. No matter how far we've drifted from love, from family, or even from ourselves, there is always a path back. But that path often begins with courage. Not the loud kind, but the soft, steady courage to show up, to listen, and to stay when it would be easier to run. We learn that motherhood is more than biology, it's a promise. And fatherhood, it's not measured in wealth or power, but in presence and grace. For anyone who has loved and lost, who has stayed silent too long, or who carries regrets like old letters never sent, this is your reminder. The life you thought had passed you by may still be waiting, just beyond the silence. All it asks is that you choose to return. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story. If it touched your heart, even just a little, we hope you'll share it with someone who might need a gentle reminder that healing, love, and second chances are still possible. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Shining Stories so you never miss a moment that matters. Your support helps us continue bringing stories that speak to the soul. Until next time, stay kind, stay hopeful, and stay connected.